My name is John Lobell. I'm a professor of architecture at Pratt Institute. You can find out more about me at johnlobell.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a recording of a lecture that I did called Between Silence and Light, Architecture as Philosophy, for the Kansas City Baroque Consortium. Trilla Ray Carter, Artistic Director. You can find out more about them at kcbaroque.org. And here's the concert program. They played mostly Baroque music on period instruments. So, I've titled my talk, Architecture as Philosophy. So let's see what we mean by that. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've gotten old enough that I've accumulated some interesting background. I studied at the University of Pennsylvania, worked with some interesting architects on major projects, did environmental sculpture. I'm director of research for something called Timeship. You can find that at timeship.org. I do massive open online courses. You can take my Frank Lloyd Wright course online for free if you go to Build Academy. Also, I have about 100 of my lectures on YouTube, so maybe you even find this lecture in a week. And you'll find more about me at johnlobell.com and at visionarycreativity.com, and then I pay students to tutor me about what I'm supposed to be doing on Facebook and Twitter. I'm not really sure. So I'm going to talk a bit about this book, Between Silence and Light, that Trilla just told you about. And I have a recent book, Visionary Creativity. So both of these are available online. I'm going to start with something a little bit peripherally related to the rest of this talk, but very related to our concert this evening, and that is about the Baroque. So I teach a survey course, the history of architecture, with a big team. I always give the Baroque lecture. And I like to say that when you look at Bach, you can see how he builds emotional richness from simple elements. So I like to make parallels between the music and the architecture. We won't take time to do that today except for one example, and that'll be our favorite Baroque architect, Borromini, Francisco Borromini. Tiny little church called San Ivo. It's just, you go in and it's just a dome. And looking at this plan, we see a lot of rich complexity. Looking at the dome, we see there's a lot going on. And looking straight up into it, it looks very arbitrary. Baroque actually, it comes from Latin languages, including Portuguese, for irregular pearl. And it was a derogatory term in architecture. It meant too much complexity. But maybe this complexity is arrived through very simple elements. So Borromini starts just with a triangle, and put a triangle going the other way, and then take every second point and put a scallop on it, then take every other one and put an inward scallop, and you have the dome. So this apparently richly complex dome was arrived at by these simple elements. Now, do we also find that in Baroque music? So let's take a favorite little piece by Bach, and let's see how he builds it up and creates it from simple elements. And this is just a little 3-minute piece. So follow the bouncing ball. What did one of Bach's sons say to him? Too many notes. Now let's go backwards. Same thing backwards. Well, we're just getting started. Let's go both directions at the same time. We're building up our triangles. And now let's get complicated. So Moebius strip is going to twist it so that if you run your finger around it, it never ends. And let's go both directions at the same time. So you'll find this on YouTube. So just put Bach Moebius strip and it'll pop right up. How do we relate architecture and music? What's the phrase? Architecture is frozen music. Right. Some real rich parallels. Anyway, back to our thought for today of architecture as philosophy. To define philosophy, you might say, philosophy seeks to understand the world and human being through intellectual means. But being in the arts, where do they come off claiming that? Is not understanding the world and human being also a role of the arts? So let's see how we might do that. So what is the philosophical question? It's really only one question. Who are we? What are we doing here? Now, if you're in academia, they sort of impose an answer to that, which is we're material creatures in a universe born 14 billion years ago in a big bang, who evolved by the accidents of natural selection and developed a big brain that gives us consciousness through the firing of neurons. I sometimes have big classes, over 100 students, and I'll say, how many people buy that? Nobody raises their hands. It's interesting. We've been fed this line continually, but how successful has that feeding been? So let's look at some alternatives that we as architects have been into. One of them is the world and we were created by a creator who left instructions. I do a course in non-Western architecture, so we look at all the world's cultures, or major ones. And so I begin the course with a questionnaire with the questions you're going to see, these propositions you're going to see here. Tell the students to come back next week and say, which one is you? And it's interesting. This is a lot of them, but I'm getting over it. I grew up in a very religious household, but now I'm getting into college. Another one is, the world is the intertwined consciousness of all beings. Our individual consciousness is a partaking of that universal consciousness. That's Buddhism, or one approach to Buddhism. This is Borobudur, great Buddhist student. We can see that intercontemplative Buddhist nature here contrasted with the psychological Western self. So this is probably the greatest Western sculpture, Michelangelo's David. This is Prajna Paramita, goddess of transcendent wisdom, a sculpture from Indonesia. The world is imbued with spirit. Human nature and spirit are one unified whole. And we see this in China and Japan, This is EC Shrine. In the West, every hero slays a dragon. Every one of them. The dragon is the earth energies of the Great Mother. And this is the adolescent youth asserting himself and slaying the mother and taking over the world. In China, that doesn't happen. The dragon is venerated. And this EC Shrine begins, and this Shinto shrine begins as just identifying a place of some power in nature. Unlike in the West, where we want our buildings to be permanent, the wood is unfinished. Here we see green mold growing into the roof. And every 20 years they build a new one, and the old one is allowed to rot and then is torn down. And this has been going on for 2,000 years. We are cultural creatures built on historical traditions. And in architecture, we see that in the Beaux-Arts architecture. So here we are in New York, Metropolitan Museum, Grand Central Station, Washington Square Arch, 42nd Street Library. Here we are in Kansas City. What this architecture is saying is that we are descendants of Rome. So here's the National Gallery, beautiful building in Washington, D.C., and it is a reproduction on the outside and on the inside of the Roman Pantheon. So this architecture is saying our identity comes from our cultural rootedness in Rome. And modern architects started to say, didn't the Roman Empire end 1,500 years ago? I can't resist the question now that I visited the museum now 3 days, and it's just a really great collection, beautiful building. How many people are really happy about the addition? How many people are unhappy about the addition? Oh, it's about 3 to 1. Cool. I'm very attuned to Stephen Hall because we had a 3-part building and the middle part burned down, so that our new middle part is by the same architect, Stephen Hall. We know the world through reason. The moral center is in the heart of each individual. So Palladio's Villa Rotunda puts the human being in the center to measure front, back, left, right, center of Cartesian coordinates. And it's interesting, this human-centeredness contrasted to the Japanese, the human being a part of nature and dissolving back into nature. Finally, the world and we are made of matter, energy, and the laws of nature. It's the one I began with. Humans came about through random accidents. Consciousness is the firing of neurons. So you can associate that with materialism, and I'll associate that with modern architecture. So here's the Bauhaus, very famous building from the 1920s in Germany. This is one of the, Oscar Schlemmer's figure at the Bauhaus, who wrote, "Reason and science, man's greatest powers, are the regents, and the engineer is the sedate executor of unlimited possibilities. Mathematics, structure, and mechanization are the elements, and power and money are the dictators of this modern phenomena of steel, concrete, glass, and electricity." So it's a materialist modernism, and the building very much reflects its functions of the workshops, classrooms, studios. But there's another modern architecture. This is Louis Sullivan, a rather ornate building of his, Guarantee Building in Buffalo. And he wrote, "The germ is the real thing, the seed of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function which is to seek and eventually find its full expression in form." So when Sullivan and his disciple, Frank Lloyd Wright, said form follows function, they did not mean this aisle has to be wide enough to accommodate the number of people who will be leaving. But rather they meant the function is the inner will of the building, and the form expresses, manifests that inner will. So the germ is the real thing. There is an essence, identity in the germ. What do we call that in materialist terms? DNA. You know, the acorn wants to be an oak tree, if you think in these terms. The DNA in the acorn mechanistically generate an oak tree, if you think in those terms. So it wants to express itself in form. And Sullivan says the office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, must express its reaching to the sky. Frank Lloyd Wright said, what is honor? Not the rules of the code, but the nature of honor. What would be the honor of a brick? That and the brick which makes the brick a brick. In other words, there's an essence in the brick which gathers to it hardness, redness, squareness. It's something that comes before the material brick. They see this essence and it speaks to them and inspires their architecture. Even Mies van der Rohe, who we know for his glass skyscrapers, says, architecture depends on its time. It is the crystallization of the inner structure of its time. So we'll look now at Louis Kahn, who inspires our theme for the season, Silence and Light. And he was born in Estonia, moved to Philadelphia at 5, studied the Beaux-Arts traditions, graduated just before the Great Crash, did a socially based architecture until the 1960s, and then started doing some of our finest buildings. If you're interested in Kahn, how many people have seen the movie My Architect? Well, highly recommended. It's a documentary about his architecture through the storytelling of his son who never really met him and is searching for his father. And that's the theme that makes it a great movie. So this is his Salk Center for Jonas Salk, developed the polio vaccine. And we see here his celebration of concrete and teak wood, a cathedral without a ceiling looking at the Pacific Ocean. The building layers, body in the tunnels and elevators, mind in the laboratories, society in the walkways where people encounter each other, culture in the offices of the scientists, and spirit in the courtyard. So the building is a mandala to the whole self. This is his Kimball Art Museum with these great vaults making beautiful space for the art. And here's a rather boxy building, the library at Exeter Prep School, but then inside it explodes up to this source of light. And Kahn begins every project with the question, what does this building want to be? And he says of the library, there would be a place with great tables on which the library could put books, and the reader would take the book and go to the light on the perimeter of the building. So again, he looks for the essence of the building and then expresses it in form. Now I'm going to do a little bit of just a moment of inside baseball here. This is Kahn's first important building, Medical Towers, University of Pennsylvania. And this is a concrete tube for air ducts. And he coats it with brick. So he's treating the brick as a veneer, like it's paint. He says, you don't treat brick that way. Bricks built Rome. You know, they're not a veneer, they can be a structure. And so in this library, these columns are actually masonry structures, they're not veneers. So just a little inside baseball there. So what does Kahn say about ourselves and our world? We saw those different ways that we could understand the world. And Kahn looked for a long time for how we would identify monumentalism. He's looking for a new monumentality. And it didn't get him anywhere. Finally he realized what he was actually looking for was order. And the first thing about order is you can't say what it is. It's like God. You can't describe God because God transcends. A description is a concept, and God transcends concept. So order, I'll say what it is even though you're not supposed to. Order is everything and the process whereby all things come into being. And so he says, I tried to say what order is, and then I stopped just saying order is. But how do you describe something that you can't describe directly? Poetic metaphor. So the poetic metaphor he uses is silence and light. And he says, inspiration is the feeling of beginning, at the threshold where silence and light meet. So, silence is the unmeasurable. When Kahn begins a building, he begins every building with the question, what does this building want to be? There are two big problems with that question. Anybody? What are the two big problems? Number one, how can a building want anything? It's a building. Number two, it doesn't exist yet. The commission just came into the office. We haven't even put pencil to paper yet. But it does exist in the realm of potential. So, the process of order is the reaching from our world into the realm of potential and the bringing of something into manifestation. So, Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, Louis Kahn are seeing architecture not as only the egotistical self-expression of the architect, but also the role of the architect as midwife to help bring something from potential into manifestation. So, the realm of potential is the realm of silence. The realm of realization is light, and art is the threshold between the two that brings things from one to the other. And light is a very powerful metaphor because it's both that thing that comes from the sun and it is this realm of realization. And he plays the two against each other, both in his architecture and his philosophy. He says, I said that all material in nature, the mountains and the streams in the air and we are made of light which has been spent. So the light hits the wall and condenses into material. So the realm of light is the realm of realization, but now I have to actually, well that was, I'm having a hard time actually making this thing happen now. Whether it's the drawings or the building department or the contractors, that's the realm of material. But he says even material we approach this way, that the brick has this inner nature, which we saw with Frank Lloyd Wright. So he says, if you're thinking of the natures, you say to brick, what do you want, brick? Brick says to you, I like an arch. If you say to brick, arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel over an opening. What do you think of that brick? Brick says, I like an arch. So he's in dialogue with the brick, just the way he is with the building itself. So we talked about we talked about 6 different worlds here. Maybe they can sort of all come together. Here are 2 of them, this Buddhist inner meditation, where we escape our ego identity to realize a transcendent identity that can be in touch with the universal oneness. Here is the individual character with a mind working behind those eyes, an individual self. So, remember we said in Buddhism, the world is the intertwined consciousness of all beings. Our individual consciousness is a partaking of that universal consciousness. So does that work in our scientific world of physics? Well, something happened to physics 100 years ago. It's called relativity and quantum theory. All that stuff about laws and space and an independent observer, that's all gone. They still teach it in high school, maybe do relativity on the last week and then skip quantum theory. But quantum theory began in 1900. I mean, it's 117 years old, and it is the theory of reality. So, two of our great physicists, James Jeans, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. That's what our physicists are saying. John Wheeler, great bringing together of quantum theory and relativity. He's a great relativity physicist, but he did important work in quantum theory. He had great students. No phenomena is a real phenomena until it is an observed phenomena. This is real. I mean, the particle's not there till we look at it. So maybe these worlds come together. In the Tao Te Ching, we read, the Tao begot one, one begot two, two begot three, and three begot the 10,000 things. So silence, light, and a material world, 10,000 things. And then, elsewhere, ever desiring, one can see the manifestations, the 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. But the two are the same. Kant says, I liken the emergence of light to the manifestation of two brothers, knowing quite well that there are not two brothers, or even one. So I know what he means by there's not two brothers, but I still haven't figured out the nor even one, so I'm still working on that. So Kant sees a world of order in which things exist in the potential realm of silence. They're brought into realization in light, and then into manifestation as material through the process of art. In silence, the building exists as form, as underlying concept. In light, it exists as design, a particular manifestation. The entire process is order, which is made up of silence and light as two brothers. Realizing they're not two, there's only one, but then he says it isn't even one. So I'll let you know when I figure out what that is. So Kant says, a work is made in the urging sound of industry. And when the dust settles, the pyramid, echoing silence, gives the sun its shadow. Thank you. We wanted to take a few minutes for questions, so. Okay, first, I wouldn't put it in that order. In other words, I think modernist materialism is still dominant. And these are minority positions that pop up here and there. And the even academia that respects Kant as the second most important American architect after Franklin Wright will not talk about his philosophy. So that my book, what my book does is present Kant's philosophy, and then I do a commentary. I present it in his words, which are extremely poetic, and then I do a commentary. The book's been very popular. It's been in print for 40 years. Every architect knows it. It's never been reviewed because nobody will talk about. They just say, "Oh, Kant was a poetic mystic." But to say that we can actually explain what this means freaks people out. So it's not discussed. So these are very minority positions of these three architects. There are other architects that feel this way. But I wouldn't say it's something that has followed modernism, but it's something that pops up, along the way. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I think this, some of the importance of modernism in general as an outgrowth of 19th century thought, in which the rejection of the Renaissance taking on was based in the thought of beauty being truth being beauty. And I think that's a really important part of the whole modern
Yes, yes, thank you. I do a whole course on that, so I have to be reduced to 2 slides. But the Kahn is certainly a modern architect. I mean, his exposing the concrete structure of his building, using that structure as his aesthetic means. So what Kahn does is not added on, but grows out of bricks, steel, concrete, and structure. So yes, there's a whole position there, but much of it is materialist. Other thoughts?
It's just my opinion, but modern people don't know silence, don't understand silence. They're afraid of silence. And they're very edgy when the silence is thrust upon them. I'm wondering if that edginess is reflected in Concerto.
Well, since it's just among us here, I'll tell you a little bit. So about 10 years ago, I was asked to teach a course in non-Western architecture. I was pretty strong in this material for various reasons. So I would do chime in and talk about Taoism and Confucianism, see how that's manifested in the architecture. Do Japan, talk about Shintoism. Do India, talk about Buddhism. I've studied with Buddhist masters for 4 years. And as of this fall, I'm not teaching this anymore. And it's been taken over by my colleagues who consider non-Western to be Marxist interpretations of post-colonialism. And I said, what, you know, well, people can't handle religion. And I've never said, this is, to my students, this is what you should believe. I said, this is what these people believe, which is why they built that way. In other words, the Japanese do not believe that humans are separated out from nature and should fight to protect ego, but rather one should dissolve ego and the oneself should be able to dissolve back into nature. That's why they do that architecture. But we can't even say that because talking that much about mysticism freaks out modern materialists. So yes, I agree. Yeah.
Question.
Did Kahn ever consider the absolute? I would say that would take a long discussion because we'd have to define absolute and all that. But I would say he rejected it because he took a more flowing position. So there's a lot of Platonism in Kahn. And so, for example, the building exists in form in the realm of silence, which is sort of a concept. And then we bring it into design on this site in this material. We might call that form absolute, and then the design is circumstantial, depending upon the budget and if it's a narrow site or a wide site or in a city or in the country, whatever. So it very much depends upon what we mean by absolute. So yeah, one more. How can silence and light help us understand the Baroque? I think that all great art works that way. In other words, if we study Bach or other Baroque composers, and we see how they, this famous remark by Mozart, you know, all the notes are there, I just haven't written them down yet, or all the notes are there, I just haven't put them in order yet. So you can see how they have a realization of what they want. Well, how would you describe that realization? by writing down the notes. And that could take a while because now we have to, oops, it's not working, we have to. So I think that if you study composition and you then study compositionally sensitive biographies of the great musicians, you'll see them doing the same thing. That starting with a realization of, particularly, I don't want to put anybody down, but I think Mozart and then Beethoven are very much reaching into other realms and then manifesting it in composition. So I would say it in that way. So thank you, because we want to get on to the music.